Walker tapped him to be the Secretary of the Department of Administration. For those of you who don't know, the Department of Administration is the agency that sort of oversees all the other agencies and is in fact responsible for aggregating all the department budget requests into a single request that becomes the governor's proposal to the legislature. So Mike is here to tell us a little bit about that proposal today. Please welcome Mike Huebsch.
Thanks. Well, thank you. I appreciate it, Keen. It's great to be here. I know we've talked about getting me up here several times to have that speech and have an opportunity to meet with each of you. And Keen's right, my political career, my elected career began in 1994. But my political career began here in Wausau with the Torkels. Dave and Lori are right here, and not many of you know this, but I managed Dave's campaign back in 1988. Is that right, Dave? Right. And I think probably the only reason Dave didn't get elected, unfortunately, but it was a great opportunity to learn more about government, and more about politics, and what it was going to take to get elected. And it was a great chance to spend a good portion of 1988 here in Wausau, getting to meet so many good people here. As Keen talked about, I am here on behalf of the governor as well as the administration to kind of walk through what it is that the governor's priorities are and what we've been through and where we're headed as far as this budget is concerned. You know, when you talk about what's going on in Madison, it's hard to talk about what's going forward until you take a look at where we've been. And many of you may remember that just 2 years ago when Governor Walker came into office, it seems like it might have been longer than 2 years ago, but just 2 years ago when we came into office, the governor was facing about a $3.6 billion shortfall. We had a deficit in the budget of $3.6 billion. We had an unemployment rate of about 7.5%, 7.7% actually in unemployment. The government for about 10 years had spent more than it was bringing in almost every year. So it had built up the deficit. It was at the point where when Governor Walker first came into office, we had outstanding bills to both Minnesota and to the patient compensation fund, money that the state Supreme Court had said the government was going to have to pay back. We had funds that we had to pay back. The state government was furloughing its employees for 2 weeks involuntarily every year just to try and meet the budget. I mean, there were a number of tricks and gimmicks that were going on to try and make sure that we were going to have a balanced budget. And it was that time that the governor recognized that there were some things that we were going to need to do in order to turn it around. And one of those things obviously was Act 10. It obviously got a lot of attention across the nation, but was something that we recognized was essential, that we were going to turn Wisconsin's fiscal house around. When I was in the legislature, and I had prior to that served on the county board from La Crosse County, when I was in the legislature, I would hear always from local elected officials, if Madison could just get their fiscal house in order, we would take care of ourselves. Well, it was something we eventually had to do. And Governor Walker knew that. He had a very simple, basic premise that he was going to build this budget and really build his entire administration around. It's a pretty simple concept. We're not going to spend more money than we have. Well, that's, again, a simple concept for each of us and our families, each of us and our businesses. But it had been disregarded for better than a decade in Madison. It's why you had seen such huge deficits build up. So by not spending more than we have, by living within our means, and figuring out ways that we could empower local governments as well as the state government to try and find savings. We have been able to not only take that $3.6 billion deficit and turn it around, but now just 2 years later, we are going to finish this budget with over a $400 million surplus. We have eliminated the furloughs and the shifting of money from one area to another, and our unemployment rate has gone from 7.7% down to 6.6%. We're turning Wisconsin around. We're moving it forward. That's the phrase the governor uses all the time. We knew we had to change things from the beginning, and we did that. But now we need to move it forward, and that's what this budget does. That's what we reflected. When the governor came out with his budget, and especially with his budget address just a couple of weeks ago, he said there was a basic theme that he wanted to move forward with and pass on to the state of Wisconsin as far as why and how he built this budget. He wanted to provide more prosperity, better performance, and true independence, both from government and for the people of the state. And he did that around 5 priorities. A budget, like anybody else's, is a priority-setting document. You know, at home we set our priorities. We're going to pay for our mortgage or our rent first. We're going to pay for clothes and food. We have to set our priorities. Government's no different. We have to set priorities as to where we're going to spend the money and how we're going to be the best stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. And so what we did and what the governor did was set those priorities up. He had 5 different priorities that he was going to build a budget around. But first and foremost, and one that we all recognize and understand, was that we needed to grow the economy. We needed to provide jobs. What Governor Walker has talked about several times is that government doesn't create jobs, people do. This is something he talked about even in his election. He said government doesn't create jobs, it creates the environment whereby those jobs will be created, or they won't, where they will grow here in Wisconsin, or they'll grow somewhere else. But when you set that as a priority and making sure that you're creating the environment, there's a lot that goes into that. First and foremost, you have to make sure that the tax climate is something that's going to be attractive, not just for businesses, but for people to live here. And it's why I think that you see when the governor had an opportunity with the surplus, with turning our budget around and getting to a surplus, the first thing he said he wanted to do was invest back into the people of the state of Wisconsin. There's over a $340 million surplus that he's putting back into the first tax rate cut in about 15 years. As a matter of fact, last time we cut tax rates, Governor Walker was in the legislature. He and I both voted for what was at that time the largest income tax cut in state history. Because we know that if we put more money in the pockets of the people who earn it, they will invest in their houses and their families, they'll invest in their community, they'll invest in their local businesses, and that will expand our economy. Jobs will be created. That's how you turn things around. Now, I know that there are people who talk about the fact that, well, this income tax cut isn't very big. We should have a bigger income tax cut. The governor doesn't disagree. I mean, he'd like to do that as well. But we also know that you have to, as we talked about right up front, live within your means. Know that you have to spend money in certain areas, and you can provide money back to the people in other areas. And so, as we move forward and work with the legislature, we'll figure out if there are ways that we can increase that income tax cut. But ultimately, to have the first tax cut in 15 years is, I think, indicative of the commitment that the governor has to making sure that we're going to grow this economy. Secondly, one of his priorities, I think the door is locked and they want to get in, so we can open that up. The second priority was developing our workforce. You know, here in Wausau and really in every part of the state, we need to make sure that we are going to have a workforce that's prepared for the 21st century, not just for the 20th century. Obviously, jobs in certain sectors and markets have left our state and moved out. Others are moving in. We need to make sure that our workforce is ready and developed to take on those new jobs. And so one of the things, well, there's several aspects of that reflect that in the budget. One of the first things that he's going to do is put a labor market analysis in there, making sure that we know what we have as far as workers and the skills that they have and the skills that they have available to them, and then match that with the jobs that are available. The interesting thing is that in the Department of Workforce Development, we have about 30 to 35,000 job openings that are posted there. We have about that number of people or employers that send those in and say, we're looking for workers. It's time for us to connect people who are looking for work with those who are looking for workers. And so that's one of the things that Governor Walker is developing a system by which we will do that. We've had that for a number of years. Why it didn't dawn on anybody we should connect those two is a little baffling to me, but that's one of the things that we're developing in this budget. And so making sure that the jobs that are available are going to be connected with people who are looking for work is a big step. But developing the workforce also means providing training for those who need it, to re-engineer their skills and make sure that they have it available. And again, the Department of Workforce Development is spearheading that effort to make sure that we are going to provide the training that's necessary to make sure that our workforce is ready and available. And then his third priority really kind of lends into that other one, and that was reforming education, just transforming the way we educate in this state. This is another one that is somewhat controversial, but it's, I think, indicative of really what the priorities and the goals of the people of the state are. Our education system right now is based on an idea that we are going to educate our children in our schools, and we're going to give them the best possible education we can. And in Wisconsin, we've done that very well for many, many years. Because when you take a look at how we stack up with other states in our ACT tests and our SATs, we always do very well. But we also need to reflect that doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing it well in every part of the state.
One of the things the governor did 2 years ago, in the last couple of years, is he teamed up with Superintendent Tony Huebsch to develop the report cards for our schools. I'm sure many of you have sought those out and figured out where your school is in your community, and whether or not it ranks in those that are exceeding expectations, or whether or not those are trailing expectations. But as with any of us with a report card, it's not enough just to have that report card. You now need to act on it. You need to figure out what you're going to do with that information. What Governor Walker has put in place is that we are going to continue our funding formula as we have right now, which is, in Wausau, you base it on the number of pupils and your property value, and we put it into a very complicated formula, and that determines how much we send back to our local schools. As a matter of fact, almost half of all the expenditures of the state from our sales and income tax go back to our local communities just to fund our schools. It is by far the #1 priority of the state budget. But what the governor wants to do with further investment is figure out ways that we're going to do that on a performance-based method. And obviously we have, for the first time, a metric by which we can determine that. We have a report card for each of our schools. We can determine whether or not we have those schools that are kind of our A and B schools, those are exceeding expectations. And what the governor is suggesting in his budget is that we'll take dollars and we'll invest in those schools. Those schools, those A and B schools that are excelling, they can invest in those, and with that, those school districts and those administrations can do what they wish with that. They can put it into additional programs. They can put it into bonus pay for their teachers who are doing well. They can do what they wish to try and make sure that A and B school is emulated. This is the model that we want to provide, and it really reflects kind of a merit-based system. We also know that there are schools that are trailing, that are not doing as well, or very much trailing in expectations. And so one of the things he's also put in there is that we're going to invest in those schools to make sure that we're seeing improvement, that those schools are going to move forward. But we also know that in some school districts, and I think when you take a look at the criteria the governor has set forth, there's about 9 school districts, mainly in the eastern side of the state, in the southeastern part of the state, where we have failing schools and they need more options. It's not just enough to make sure that we have schools that are trying to succeed, but we need to make sure that, as with every education system, the main goal is to educate the child, to make sure that they have the skills necessary to take them through life. It is not, an education system is not there to maintain the status quo or to defend a fiefdom or figure out a way that we can keep a program going that may or may not be working. What we need to do is figure out how we're going to educate those children and give them the skills they're going to need. And that's why the governor has said we're going to expand our education system, not just to public schools, but also to charter schools, and in that mechanism, as well as in some of those schools, go to private voucher system. A private school system through a voucher that is available to those families and to those children to seek out areas where they can get the education they need. In those school districts, I know that that's a somewhat controversial system, but we've had it in Milwaukee for now going on 25 years. And in Milwaukee, where it first began with Governor Tommy Thompson and Representative Polly Williams, a Democratic representative from Milwaukee, this has been a system that has developed in Milwaukee and tried to educate children and give them an opportunity to learn in a setting that's going to be best for them. What we see is that under the governor's criteria, if you have at least 2 failing schools in your district, you can seek out the opportunity to get vouchers for your students. What this is going to mean is that in each of these school districts, in about the 9 school districts that are out there, we know that there are at least 1,000 students that are in failing schools. We cannot sit back and say, hey, we're getting to you, we'll do what we can, we'll do it our best. We can't write off a generation of students. We recognize that we need to make some changes now. It's why the governor is expanding the school voucher system in those areas to give an opportunity to those 1,000 students to get to a school that's going to be best for them. So reforming education is another big aspect of it and a priority. The 4th priority that the governor put in this budget is building up our infrastructure and making sure we have a strong infrastructure. And obviously when we talk about infrastructure, everybody knows and talks about roads and bridges and highways. I mean, that's really what we know. And frankly, under the 20th century model of infrastructure, we know that with roads, bridges, and highways in Wisconsin, about 80% of all jobs are within about 4 miles of a major highway. That's really, I mean, it links, there's a direct correlation. We need to get workers to the job, and we need to get products to market. And so the governor is going to continue to invest in those areas. But we also know that we've taken a look at the way that funding is happened in past years. And we know going forward it's going to be very difficult for that funding mechanism to sustain that infrastructure. And so he's looking at diversifying the way that we pay for those roads and highways and bridges. One of the things that he's doing is taking our transit system, our bus system, if you will, biennial, and in the second year of the biennium, moving it into the general fund, taking some pressure off of the transportation budget, figuring out ways that we can diversify the dollars that are going in there, so that we have a long-term sustainable system that's going to be available for generations to make sure that the economy is going to be strong. But infrastructure, when the governor talks about it, is not just highways, roads, and bridges. Because in the 20th century, you needed to be within 4 miles of a highway. In the 21st century, you better be about 2 feet from a computer if you want your business to do well. You need to make sure that your information technology infrastructure is strong. The governor has dollars in the budget that are set aside to make sure that we are investing in our rural information technology especially. I said it earlier to one of our TV stations when I was being interviewed. I said, the next Bill Gates could be sitting in a garage in Rothschild. But if they don't have that computer hooked up to make sure that business is going to be known, we won't know it. We need to make sure that in Wisconsin we have that infrastructure in place. So it's not just roads, highways, and bridges, but it's also information technology. And finally, infrastructure also means energy. We have to turn on the lights, and we need to make sure that there's heat and air conditioning available. And the governor will continue to monitor the energy system that we have in place here in Wisconsin and make sure that we have that available. We have low-cost, quality, and affordable energy available to all of our people across the state. Fifth and finally, the priority that the governor reflected in this budget is reforming government. And this is something that he came into in one of our first cabinet meetings. One of the first times he met with his full cabinet, he said, I've been out, I've spent the last year talking to people across the state. And he said, one of the things I want to do here in Madison is change that culture that we have here. Figure out a way that we can change it from what he hears is kind of an adversarial based system where an individual or a business would call up the DNR or call up the Department of Workforce Development or something like that and really not get good customer service, not get what they were looking for, and change that culture, turn it around completely. And he said it starts from the top down. Each one of the cabinet secretaries need to reflect that and make sure that in their agency we're changing that culture. And that's one of the things you're seeing, not only as far as in each of the agencies, but we're now digging in and figuring out things that in government we need to do that government or that businesses have done for a number of years. How can we be a more lean government? How can we do this in kind of the Six Sigma and other practices that have been used in businesses for so many years? How do we apply that in each of our agencies? And there's kind of a healthy competition going on between the secretaries right now as to how we can figure out a way that we can make our process more streamlined, how we can be better as far as providing customer service to our people. And then lastly, the governor also set aside and established a Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Commission right in the beginning. He said, I want to make sure that we take a look and that there's an analysis of the waste and fraud and abuse that's going on in state government. And that commission came up with over $300 million of what they identified as waste, fraud, and abuse ways that we could change things and figure out how we're going to save and streamline government. So the implementation of that was reflected over the last 2 years, and more of it's reflected in this budget. Most notably, the Office of Inspector General in the Department of Health Services. In the Department of Health Services, which is Medicaid, Badger Care, Senior Care, and all those programs that are available for so many of our citizens, we need to make sure that those resources are available for our people and that the people who are getting them deserve them, that they're eligible for them, that it's not being wasted or it's not being through fraud or abuse lost. And so it's those type of things that there's just a culture change that we're trying to go through. Those are the priorities that the governor has set forth as far as this budget is concerned. First and foremost, the one thing he has said from day one is we need to make sure that we are going to create a strong economy in Wisconsin, one where jobs can be created. Because when we came into office, we had over the previous 3 years lost 150,000 jobs in Wisconsin. We have now added tens of thousands. And of course, everybody knows the governor has made the promise that he's going to do all he can to get to 250,000 jobs created in his first 4 years. That's the thing that he has never backed away from. And it's not so much that he does this because he needs to reach that goal. It's more so that he celebrates one job being created, one person being employed, because he knows that changes that person's life. It changes the life of that family. It changes just a little bit the life of that community. And as we can get closer and closer to that 250,000 mark, and we just continue to add jobs, and we create the environment whereby our economy is going to get strong, then Wisconsin will once again be that shining star in the upper Midwest, where people recognize that their government is innovative and their people, their businesses are moving forward. So that's that's really the message I bring here tonight. It's the goal and the vision that the governor has for the next 2 years, and it's why we're very, very excited about the next couple of years and the direction that the state is going. And so it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. I thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or do whatever you like.
So let me start you with one, I'm sure there'll be from the audience. Could you just briefly run down what's happening in the big four programs? So from last time, so Medicaid, K-12,
Sure.
University, and local aid?
And local aid, sure. Well, the big four, as Keene says, is really the big areas where we spend money in state government. I mean, it's when you take a look at the budget, it really breaks down into about 5 areas total, and they really consume about 80–85% of the budget. First and foremost, as I talked about, was K-12 education. And I touched a little bit about what we're doing there. You know, there's more performance-based funding. There's going to be additional revenue that's going in for our schools. But we're really trying to get to a point where we reflect the needs of the community and really figure out a way that we can reflect the performance that we're seeing out of those schools. So the school report cards, the funding based on performance, that's really where we're focusing our K-12 education budget. The second area where we spend the lion's share of our money is in our human services programs, and that's Medicaid and Badger Care and Senior Care and all those others. And probably the one thing that has gotten the most attention is the Medicaid system and whether or not the governor was going to take the money from the federal government and then implement the Affordable Care Act and move forward with the expansion of Medicaid. And what the governor decided to do was kind of a hybrid system. And really, this is where, when he talks about true independence, this is what he's referring to. The idea that we were going to expand Medicaid and take what may be some money from the federal government for a certain period of time, we knew was going to be, in the long term, very detrimental to the budget of Wisconsin. We knew we weren't going to see the federal money for a long term, it wasn't going to be there forever, and it was going to provide a system whereby more people were going to be on the government programs. And so what the governor decided to do was, right now we have a system where people can get Badger Care or Medicaid at a certain level of the federal poverty level. Right now it's higher than 100%, but it's capped, basically saying that the enrollment is capped. So if you get to a certain level, then even if you're eligible, even if you're at a point where you should be getting this service, we're not going to provide it to you because it's been capped, and it's been capped for a number of years. What the governor did was he lowered the eligibility rate to down to 100% of the federal poverty level. So if you were eligible at a higher level, you're no longer eligible for that care, all right? But what he also did is he removed the cap. So now anybody under 100% of the federal poverty level is going to have access to that health care. Essentially what it's going to do is take almost 250,000, 224,000 citizens in Wisconsin and give them access to health care that they don't have right now. But beyond that, what he's going to do is over 100% of the federal poverty level, under the Affordable Care Act, you have those health care exchanges. You have the opportunity for people with federal government subsidies to go out and get their private health insurance. And so that's really what he talks about, is not necessarily just being dependent on an expanded government health care program, but going out and purchasing your own health care, making sure that you have the health care and the health care policies that are important for you. So that's probably the one that's getting the most attention. But there's a lot of reforms that he's talking about that didn't get as much attention in this budget, from unemployment and all those other programs that are out there, where he really wants to try and change the culture in that area as well. I mean, people who are unemployment are now going to be required to go out and seek employment at least 4 times a week, doubling the amount of times you're going to need to do that, because we know, and for the most part, the vast majority of people on unemployment don't want to be there anymore. They want to go out and provide for themselves. They want a job. So that's those types of reforms are what we're doing in the second biggest area. The third is the university system. And the governor has, a couple of years ago, many of you may have seen that we wanted to try and provide a level of autonomy to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, whereby they were going to make a lot of their decisions separate from the legislature. They were going to get essentially a block grant of money. They could set tuition, they could set salary, they could do a number of other things, and within that block grant of money, they have the autonomy to do what they wish, something they don't have right now. Well, 2 years ago it failed because the rest of the campuses said, well, we'd like that same autonomy. The reason the governor went with Madison is because Madison had already described this, had already laid out a plan, and we felt that Madison was prepared to kind of pilot this system. Well, we've had now 2 years to work through this, and we've worked through it with UW system. And so the governor has provided that to now the entire system. A block grant that's going to go to each of those schools whereby they'll be able to set tuition and they'll be able to set the salaries and the benefits and all of those type of things. Within that block grant, they'll know the money they're getting, and they will have the opportunity then to have the autonomy to cover their own budget. It's why you're seeing so many university professors or so many university administration coming out and saying this is the best budget they've had in 20 years. Well, it's basically cutting them loose. It's giving them the autonomy that we think is going to provide greater accountability. When they have the ability to make these decisions locally, and of course the people who are paying tuition, either the students or more often than not the parents, see how that money is being spent and know that those campuses have the autonomy to determine where it should be spent and where it's going to be spent. That gives that accountability. So that's really where the governor is reflecting in the university budget. I'll finish this and then I'll come to you. Local aids is another one where we've frozen the local aids. I mean, local aids are going to be where they are right now. We have through Act 10 provided a great deal of autonomy to local communities and local boards to make some of the benefit decisions that they have, and really to set up local boards, village boards, county boards, city councils, school boards, have really turned them not so much into what they were, which was the negotiators with the unions, but now turn them into actual employers, where as employers they can determine how best to retain and keep their employees, what benefits they can and should provide for them, what they expect out of those employees. That's really where I think the true legacy, the long-term legacy of Act 10 is going to be the creativity that's been unleashed at the local level and for those local boards to make those decisions. The fifth one that you didn't mention is corrections. And when you take those 5 areas, you take corrections, so it's K-12 education, all of our human services programs, the University of Wisconsin, our local aids, our shared revenue system, and then finally corrections. You take those, well over 80% of the state budget is in those 5 areas. And corrections, we're seeing a leveling off of our inmates, and we're going to continue to continue programs that are going to keep that level. We're going to continue to provide that funding. But as Governor Walker was the author of not 3 strikes, but what was the legislation that basically said if you're sentenced to a certain period of time, you're going to do that. Pardon me? Truth in Sentencing. Thank you very much. He was the author of Truth in Sentencing. It's unlikely that he's going to back off of that model. And so what we're doing is we're keeping the Truth in Sentencing, strengthening that, and making sure that the revenue is there to keep those who have earned prison in prison. So it's those areas that we're looking at as far as the big areas of the state budget. Yes, sir.
Would you elaborate on the student voucher system and how it actually helps those students in those failing schools?
Certainly. The student voucher system, as we've seen in Milwaukee, gives students, especially in Milwaukee right now, the opportunity to go into a private school. They can choose the private school, and essentially what it does is gives a voucher to the parent and says, depending on the school you want them to go to, here's the voucher. Now, the interesting thing about the voucher system is we actually spend less per pupil for the private school than we do in the public schools. I mean, it's one of the things, especially representing lacrosse for 16 years, that I always got questions about is why would you be taking so much of lacrosse money and sending it into these private schools in Milwaukee? And I went back and said, well, these kids are going to get an education one place or another. It's either in really what we saw many failing schools in Milwaukee, or they can take that and take it to a private school and get a better education if it works for them. If it's something that's beneficial for them, great. But it's interesting. I've toured some of those schools in Milwaukee, and some of the students who were there said, yeah, my brother and I was talking to a boy about 9th grade. He said, my brother and I came here a couple of years ago, and I think it's great. It works great for me, but it didn't work for him. He went back to the public school. I said, well, that's interesting. I mean, that's the kind of choice that those students can make, and both of them are doing very well. But because we spend less per pupil in those private schools, there's actually a savings to the other schools because of the pot of money that's available. Now there'll be more money available in that pot of money, in that pot that we fund our schools. But we'll also give those students an opportunity in those communities to go and choose the school that they wish to go to. It's again, the reflection and the thing that needs to be discussed is it's the public school system. Yes, we need to have a public school system, not necessarily because we need to have that system, but we need to have, in order for a true democracy to succeed, you have to have an educated electorate. You have to have an educated populace. Well, if they're not getting educated in some of those failing schools, we need to figure out how they're going to get educated, be it in a charter school or in a private school. Yes, ma'am.
I still have a question about, if you mentioned the the number of 1,000 students in maybe a failing school, some of those parents, no matter how you cut it, are not going to make the choice to take their child out. Either they don't understand because of language barriers, they can't move, their job situation or whatever, to get their children to a different school. How come they didn't look at instead putting the money to elevate the school for all 1,000 students rather than just a few who have the opportunity to leave with a voucher? And then along with that is, how are they going to provide report cards to those schools where the kids take their vouchers and go? So you know whether you can judge or weigh and see, compare your apples and apples and pears and pears.
Well, the best way, I'll take those in reverse order if I could. I mean, the best way is to monitor your students is kind of test them and make sure that, again, in an apples-to-apples situation, that they're doing well. One of the provisions in the governor's budget is that he's now requiring all students in the state to take the ACT test. Now, the ACT test is changing.
But that's at the very end of the ballgame.
Well, of course, but there's testing all along the way. You need to determine whether or not those students are being successful all along the way. And even in the private schools, they test to make sure that their students are doing well. I mean, don't get me wrong. You're going to have students that are going to fail in a private school as well. I mean, students are going to...
But still, there's still going to be kids left behind. Out of your whole 1,000, you maybe have, what do you think, 300, 400 who might leave?
Who might leave? Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many may leave. I mean, essentially what we're doing is recognizing that a student needs to have access to education in the best setting that's going to work for them. And if they are in a failing school and it's not working for them and they're struggling, then they have now the option to go into either a public charter school or into a private voucher school. And really, the whole motivation is to get to a point where they're going to get the education they need and address some of the things you talked about. As far as those failing schools, why aren't we investing in those failing schools? And we are. I mean, that's one of the things the governor is taking some of the dollars for as well. As I talked about earlier, that high-performing schools are going to get additional revenue. But those that are failing to meet expectations are going to get additional money as well. It's going to be additional money and direction and oversight to make sure that they're improving. And as long as they continue to improve, we will continue to invest. But when those schools cannot improve, when those students aren't getting the education, that's when they need to have an option to go somewhere else and get the education that they need. I forgot the second question. I answered two of them.
Report, how are you going to manage in voucher schools that might sometimes be not under the umbrella of the public sector? How are you going to get report cards from them to find out how kids are doing?
Yeah, and that's a model that we've seen in Milwaukee for some 20-odd years. that the testing that we see and the success of those students and monitoring of those students is something that's a model that's already set up in Milwaukee to make sure that we're testing along the way to determine whether or not they're doing well. And don't get me wrong, as I said, some students even in that system won't do as well as they could. They will not succeed. But the goal...
So would money go to Khan Academy and some of these other places that are done in the auspices? Would parents perhaps be able to apply and get a voucher and get that money and have their child go to the Khan Academy and apply and do some of the other things?
What is Khan Academy?
That's the system that's set up in the cloud, more or less.
Oh, online.
Teaching
Oh, I'm sorry.
modules
You did say that. Okay, an online school. Well, it's homeschooling. It's online. It's any mechanism by which the student is going to be able to succeed. That's what is now going to be available to the students in those school districts. I mean, that's really again the motivation here is just to be student focused, to make sure that they have the ability to do that and provide the funding that's necessary in order to get them that education.
I guess I'd like to go in this direction. I would like to just make a couple of comments and then ultimately lead to a question.
Sure.
I guess to start with, I realize your basic function is to defend the budget and the governor and yourself. I realize that.
Well, I helped build it, so yes, I want to defend it. Right.
Quite frankly, in my opinion, this administration, including your agency, including yourself, in my opinion, has some real credibility factors.
Okay.
We believe, according to what I have heard, it's really important to evaluate teachers, schools, etc. Okay?
Right.
I would imagine that probably most people aren't going to disagree with that.
Right.
What I would like to do is basically suggest or challenge that we do the same thing for every agency at the state level, including yours. And quite frankly, if I go back, I sat in this room and a lot of people were here about a year ago. I listened to Mr. Paul Jadine, I believe his name, from the WEDC.
Oh, Paul Jaden.
Jaden.
Yes, sorry.
Give his song and pony dance, and I'll put it that way.
You just did.
And we saw what has happened to this agency this past year, the disaster it has been. I have got something here where I believe this is yours. Top official apologized to the Economic Development Board. I see something a member of the job board defends the move of the governor by not revealing information to the board when they were criticized. I have an executive summary of that agency. Number 4 says, what we really need to do is to be measured and be accountable. Taxpayers' investments and customers' impact is enhanced when desired outcomes are clear and individuals and organizations are accountable.
Right.
But this organization failed in their own thing, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I would like to address some other things.
Can I address that and then let you go to the next one?
And that's my question.
Oh, okay.
For the agency.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to have all of these agencies, including your own, which my understanding has been months late in reports that are due, months late, WEDC I already referred to. I believe the workforce development came out last year, and one of the things it said for this last year, we were going to have 200 more job fairs. It was not met. They were also going to meet that thing that you talked about matching employers with employees.
Right.
That was not met.
Sure it is.
You're still talking about that. You're talking about tourism. We had something like the mine controversy, which is still out there. If I remember about a year ago, the Secretary of Tourism, Kathy, whatever his name,
DNR, Debbie.
DNR, I'm sorry,
Kathy Step.
DNR.
Yep.
came out at that point in time and said, blasted those who were opposed to that, and said, everything is great, everything is fine. Now, over a year later, we are still facing that. Same thing. As a secretary of that agency, number one, I don't think that was his place, but that's my opinion. I guess I have a lot of other things, voucher schools and the whole thing. We've got voucher schools, everything we read say, okay, some of those voucher schools are not as successful. We've already measured them. Yet now we are proposing new voucher schools, and we're saying, let's measure them in 4 or 5 years. If we have a measurement right now, some of them are failing. Why in the world would we go out there and say we're going to create more of these, without using what we have already? I could go on, but I want other people to share.
Appreciate it.
I would like you to, my question is still, would you commit every agency to the same criteria of saying, this is our goals and objectives at the beginning of the year.
Right.
At the end of the year, evaluate us the same as we're saying for school teachers, for anybody else.
Absolutely, and it's exactly what we do. The WDC is a great example. WDC, the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, is something the governor created to get out of the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce was something that was designed to try and build our economy through the state system. And the Department of Commerce for years and years and years became just more bureaucratic morass. I mean, that's really what it became. The WDC was designed to pull that out and really get to, I remember when we designed it, the governor said, let's just take everything out that isn't economic development. And so what the WDC did was went in and started digging into what had happened in the Department of Commerce for the past 20 years. And I just talked to one of the TV stations about the fact that they, as the messenger, have taken most of the arrows. What we have found out in developing that and taking a look through the WEDC is that there were a number of companies that hadn't paid back loans that were offered to them by the state. Some of them for 4,000 days hadn't paid back the loan. That extends a little bit beyond the Walker administration. And so what we see is that the WEDC is working on figuring out ways that we can expand the economy, use the dollars that are available, and not get tied into the bureaucratic red tape that was developed in the Department of Commerce. So you can continue to go after the Department of WEDC, and they will make mistakes. I will tell you this right now. You can hold us accountable to any measure you wish, and we may not match up to all of those. Much like the schools that you talked about, may not match up to all of those, both private and public. But you need to make sure that as taxpayers, as voters, that you're taking a look at every one of those. Department of Administration, Department of Economic Development Corporation, or any other department, and set those standards up. We have those out there. You can measure us by any measure you wish, by any direction you want us to go. That's available to you right now. What are you doing? What is it that the Department of Administration does? My department oversees the budget. We need to make sure that the budget is going to come in and it's going to be legal, it's going to follow what the legislature and the governor has signed. And what we've done in the 2 years that we've been there is taken a $3.6 billion deficit and turned it into a $400 million surplus. Measure me by that. I'm very comfortable with that. That's
Can I
why.
make one more comment?
Sure.
Just on that, then I'll move on.
Yep.
My understanding also when you're talking about that budget, from what I've heard and read and everything, that we are now facing a structural deficit in the next, at the end of the next budget.
Yeah. Do you know what a structural
And
deficit is?
The accounting, what I'm saying
Yeah.
also, and if I go back to Governor Wausau, we talked about what accounting measures we're going to
Right.
use.
Generally accepted accounting principles. That's where you're going with that.
And
Right. Yes.
So what are you going to use? And when you're talking about communicating,
Right.
that's fine. But in the name of transparency, I challenge every agency out there to put out what your goals and objectives are.
It's on most of our websites.
Yeah, on most of your websites.
All of them. Name me an agency where you don't see that.
Still talking, could you just?
You haven't checked. All right, here's the bottom line. With generally accepted accounting principles, I'd be happy to have this debate with you when we're not, wrong with everybody, because you're wrong on so many accounts. But in the generally accepted accounting principles, what the governor has said is that we need to try to move state government to that. There's no question that's what he'd like to do. That's the direction he'd like us to go. And the problem is that for decades, we have now built up to a generally accepted accounting principle deficit of nearly $3 billion. To try and turn that around overnight is almost impossible. The other thing that you talked about was the structural deficit. And the structural deficit is important because it's something that's been around. The $3.6 billion deficit was partially a structural deficit, not entirely, but partially. And what that says is that you are about to pass a budget for the next 2 years, 2013 to 2015. You're going to pass a budget that you know how much you're bringing in. What that's going to mean is that based upon what you're probably going to bring in over the next 2 years, you're spending more than you're going to have in those next 2 years if you don't include any economic growth. If there's no growth in your economy at all, then you're going to be short. And in our structural deficit, we're $188 million short going into the next budget if there's no economic growth. The economic growth we're getting in this budget is $1.3 billion. And our economy isn't exactly going gangbusters right now. It's growing, but it's not going gangbusters. We will wipe out a $188 million structural deficit in about 2 months, just through economic growth. So while people like to point to, oh, you won't have as much money in the next one because of the structural deficit doesn't include any kind of economic growth, which we know is going to occur. So there is no deficit. As a matter of fact, you have a surplus. I'll go to you and then you.
Just contacted the state agency today, and I found it very refreshing that they were very customer service oriented. So you guys have nailed that down.
Which one?
Dave Ross.
Oh, good.
I actually asked for him, and he was out for the week, so put me on to the person that could help me, and within an hour I had an email. The state government is incredibly responsive, and that goes throughout all of the departments that I've contacted. As a small business guy, I'm in contact with them all the time. That was a comment. The question is, why only the scholarship program, as I call it, versus vouchers for Milwaukee? Why not roll that out through the rest of the state?
Oh, why just, well, the voucher system is what the governor is doing. He's set up criteria whereby if you have a certain number of students and schools that are short, then you can go into the school, into the private voucher system. The question is, in many parts of the community, and frankly, I don't think Wausau will qualify, I know La Crosse won't qualify, but as we move into that system, it's obviously something that comes with great change and great consternation. And so as we move to that system with those communities, we want to make sure that it's going to be successful. If you jump into it entirely right away, it may not be something that's going to be sustainable. So we want to try to expand it. We've done it in Milwaukee for a number of years. It seems to be working. Racine is desperately in need of it, but we're going to move it up into other communities, again, providing them the option to move into that if they wish.
And I think that's a good idea to take it slowly. As a father of 7 kids who I homeschooled them all, and it turns out I have 2 teachers, or 2 of my oldest daughters have master's degree in elementary education, so somehow I guess I've done a little bit of something right, but it would have been nice to have that funding along the way. So.
Understand, but as I talked about earlier, the most important goal, the essential component of education is to make sure that we have an educated populace. Mm-hmm. You know, a democracy can't survive without it. And so how we're going to get there and how we're going to do it is not something you really want to screw around with too much. You want to make sure you're doing it in a way that's going to make sure that those students are going to be available for us for generations. Go ahead, their hand. Oh, yeah, sir.
Surprisingly, my question was the same as Bob's. But I had another question. I think it was your office about a year ago put out a study that you guys had done on the food stamp program and the various amounts of fraud that were being committed through there by the users. And I guess I'm wondering if we could have an update as to what has been done with the results of that report in the last year or so.
Yeah, it was mainly through the Department of Children and Families, Department of Workforce Development, some of those other departments. As we looked at that, there have been some high-profile cases that have been tracked down, and you've been aware of those. What we are doing is changing that system to make sure that there's more monitoring in place, that there is more regular determination of whether or not those who are getting the food stamps are eligible for it. As I said, we're setting up Office of Inspector Generals in some of the agencies like Health Services to make sure that those are in place. The one thing you want to make sure along the way, especially when you're talking about food stamps and some of these other benefits, is you do not want to take somebody who's eligible for that off of it without or in a way that they have not been in violation of anything. And so that's in many families an essential component of their sustenance. And so we're making sure that we're making that change, we're monitoring it, we're making sure that they are eligible for the program. And I guess the update I can give you is that while that change has provided a great deal of savings and opportunities so that we can make sure that the food stamps go to more people who are eligible, we will continue to monitor the fraud and waste and abuse that occurs there as we are in every other agency. We're making progress because of some of the high-profile cases you've seen. You know, as you go out and you're able to find those areas, obviously that gets a lot of attention. But there's some of those smaller ones as well that may not get the attention, but we're finding improvements in almost every area of the state. Yes, sir.
Just a couple of things here. I was really going to ask about 2, but I was reminded of that WEDC. When that was set up, I read through the bill, how it's structured, and I looked at that, and to me it was inherently flawed to begin with. And I'm not at all surprised that problems came up. The real problem to me is the fact that it can do most of its business in closed session, and people don't even know what's happening. I don't know if you're aware, but about the first year after that was created, I would ask different people, do you know what the Economic Development Corporation is? And they didn't know a thing about it. They didn't, much less how it was set up and how it was structured. And I think there's some real problems in how it was set up. And I was surprised, but not surprised, that the legislature pushed that right through. Okay. The other thing was, when you described the goals of the budget, supposedly those were the original goals of Governor Walker's first budget, pretty much. But to me, there was a real disconnect. It was jobs, jobs, jobs. And I didn't see anything coming up about jobs in the legislation that crossed the governor's desk for like almost a year and a half. That's, to me, that was a disconnect. It was about concealed and carry. It was about all kinds of things, but nothing happened with jobs. In fact, the first thing before we even had a legislature was the end of high-speed rail. And that was unfortunately another thought or whatever. But you were talking about innovative ways to fund transportation, different ways. We might need some different modes of transportation. We've got all our eggs in one basket, highways. And I happen to be on the county board and travel around this state, Minnesota, all over. I really don't see financially how we're going to maintain this highway system. It is just so huge and it is so overburdened that to project, a few years ahead, how that's going to be possible in the same way we've done it in the past.
Right.
Okay, and the last thing, I don't know, I'm really curious if the administration is addressing this, but I went to the CAFR that ends in June 2012.
Right.
And I looked at the long-term debt. And in 1 year, that increased $568 million. And the interest alone went up 9%. And yet, I keep hearing how we're out of debt, the state's out of debt, from various politicians. So, what's happening with that? What's the plan for that? Does it just go on? Does it keep increasing? Can it just increase?
All right, well, I'll try to take those in order, if I remember them all. But first, the jobs legislation. I would say quite to the contrary. The governor actually, in one of his first acts, called the legislature into special session on jobs and passed a number of pieces of legislation that was specifically designed to make sure that, as I talked about earlier, Wisconsin was going to have a better environment for the jobs. Government doesn't create those jobs, so we need to figure out how we're going to provide the stability necessary and the taxation, the regulatory structure in place so that businesses will want to grow and expand here. And that has been occurring for some time. Just last week, as a matter of fact, there were some bipartisan pieces of legislation that both Republicans and Democrats were talking about as far as changing our regulatory process, figuring out ways that we can make Wisconsin more attractive for jobs. So there has been a great deal of attention. The fact that concealed carry and high-speed rail, those get the headlines. But when you see bipartisan cooperation on legislation that's going to move jobs forward, it's hard to get that in the newspaper. So, unless the newspaper's here, no offense. But, I mean, those are the type of things that are challenged to sometimes get in. So that legislation has been occurring for some time. So there has been an approach to that. Don't get me wrong. Wisconsin still is far behind as far as the job creation that we'd like to have. We're doing all we can to make sure we get to that point, and some of the things I talked about are headed in that direction. The other one that I'll talk about is transportation, and I think there was one in between there that I missed. But on transportation, you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, a commission report just came out and said we won't be able to fund our road system the way we have for the years past as we go forward. And that's why the governor addressed some of those concerns. But in Wisconsin, again, we fund our roads on gas tax and registration fee. I mean, that's really it. And so the gas tax, obviously, our friends from Illinois and Minnesota and whoever passes through helps pay for those then. But the registration fee is all on us. The governor has not raised either of those fees. What he is suggesting instead is some of the things I talked about is taking some of the pressure off of the transportation budget by taking transit, our buses, and put it into the general fund, which is, at this point, a more stable account. He's also looking at ways that we are going, I know what it was, is borrowing, because this also applies to transportation. He's looking at ways that we're going to borrow and bond for projects like the Home Bridge in Milwaukee, the Marquette and the Zoo interchanges, to make sure that those projects stay on pace. What he's doing to reflect that, however, is that he has charged me to go out and find out what excess property we have, surplus property we have in the state of Wisconsin that we can sell. I mean, if you take a look at it again, the state budget is going to reflect what happens for most of us. If we're going to have our regular monthly bills, you don't go out and borrow money to pay off your monthly bills. But you do borrow money if you're going to put on a new roof, or you're going to put on an addition, if you're going to purchase a house. These are capital improvements that you're going to pay off over time, because that's how long those capital improvements generally last. But what he's asking me to do is take a look at each agency. It's in the budget that each agency must do an analysis of the excess property that they have. One that I'm looking at that's getting a lot of attention is the power plants. You know, we have a number of power plants that the state owns that provides power to our institutions. Since there are people who do this for a living, most notably utilities, the question has been for 20 years in Madison, why does the state own those plants? Why can't we get rid of those plants and make sure that we're going to get the power that's needed, but we don't need to own and operate those plants? So selling those is one of those options that obviously is a complicated formula to determine how we're going to get the power in the long haul and make sure that that's available. But that's one of the things we're looking at, but there's other areas. Department of Transportation is an example. I mean, they'll know that in a tract of land like this, they're going to put a road this way. Well, about 15 years ago, they decided instead to go that way with the road. But they still own this. So let's figure out whether or not we can sell that. I mean, it's those type of things. It's figuring out ways that we can take one-time money, the sale of some of these properties, to pay off one-time expenses, the long-term bonding. So it's some of those things that the governor's trying to do to address the overall borrowing and bonding. But your other question on that was, how long can this go on? The state of Wisconsin has a standard borrowing level and a standard borrowing system by which, you know, with all of the university structures we have, really that's where most of our buildings are, is in the university system. With the few that we have as far as state office buildings around the area and around the state and certainly in Madison, those need constant maintenance, they need replacement on occasion. It's those type of things that we do, as we're paying off bonds, as we're paying them off over time, the bonds from 10, 15, 20 years ago, we are borrowing more so that there's a constant level that we can expect as far as just the cost of maintaining these buildings. The bottom line is, as long as we have those buildings, we will have to continue to maintain them. And so that will require a constant cycle, if you will, of the borrowing to do so. Exactly, precisely. Now, who did I say was? Yes, ma'am.
How is the state coming with venture investment funds for entrepreneurs and small business?
Yeah, this is another question that kind of goes to some of the concerns you had. Venture capital in Wisconsin is something that we trail. You know, I live in the La Crosse area, so I'm 12 miles from Minnesota, and Minnesota likes to show how they have much more investment in venture capital. They have angel investors that are well beyond Wisconsin's level, and we do it much better than they do it much better than we do. What the governor did a couple of years ago was try to develop a venture capital fund that really was going to be that that seed money, that angel investment, that the recognition that we may have some small businesses, that gentleman in Rothschild in his garage that I talked about, that may need that investment capital. But we also know that in the past few years, capital has become more difficult to get. Banks and credit unions are under more restrictions to limit the ability to give as much as they have in years past, mainly because we saw that system didn't do very well under complete lack of oversight. And so it's a little stricter. And so what we're doing is the governor in his budget, and in his budget address specifically said he was putting $25 million aside for investment capital. But because there was constant political debate and bickering as to how we're going to do that, what he said in his speech is, I'm setting $25 million aside. He's put it at DOA. He said, I'm asking the legislature to work with me to come up with the means by which we will use that money to develop venture capital. Venture capital inherently is riskier than other investments. When you're investing in something that's a sure thing, that's you know you're going to get a certain level of return, that's very good. But when you have the need for companies, especially here in Wisconsin, to go out and get some of that startup money, to get some of that angel investment that's going to take them to the next level, it's inherently more risky, but it also has a much higher value and a much higher return. So he has set some money aside for that purpose. It still is dwarfed by some of the venture capital funds you see in other states, but it's certainly going to provide an opportunity for us to head down that path. The key here is that the legislature needs to work with us, and specifically the governor, to make sure that there's a system in place to put that, make that available to businesses. And that's the task that they're now working on. So that's where we're going. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to get back to voucher schools.
Yep.
And I'd like to compare voucher schools the way the plan is now with now, not with what the governor is talking about in the future.
Okay.
Because public schools are, if I understand it, required to do the testing and provide special services, whether it's counselors or reading specialists, those kinds of things, to the private schools. Like, to the voucher schools. schools to private schools.
Not in all of them, but in those areas where they need it, yes, there's usually an agreement set up between the
Right.
schools. Yeah.
And when you talk about the voucher schools being cheaper than the public schools,
Right.
but the public schools are taking everybody, and we talk about all those other expenses. And I don't think, I think talking about apples and oranges, your comparison was really unfair. And I did read that the governor was thinking about having the students then be tested the way public schools did. When you talk about failing schools, you don't have any failing schools this currently in private schools because you haven't been having them tested in private schools like they are public. It's just unfair, even our papers say school vouchers don't work.
Well, if it's in the paper, it must be true.
But I'm a retired teacher, I'll be honest. And I think public schools are for lots of good reasons. And I think it hurts the rest of the community. Anything that's not going well hurts everybody. And so taking public funds, putting it in private schools, and having no accountability is bad use of public money.
Fair enough. I would say that the testing does occur. You're monitoring those schools, and those schools are overseen by the Department of Public Instruction to make sure that those schools are producing quality education for those students. It's not necessarily comparing apples to apples, I understand that, because we have a structure in place under the public system that's been there for 100 years. So that structure is certainly available for us to be able to monitor those schools. But ultimately, the idea that really setting up competition, if you will, within this school system, making sure that students have the opportunity to go into a private school system, and really setting up competition with the public system to make sure that both are going to be held more accountable, that both are going to have to exceed and excel. I mean, I don't think anybody, certainly in the American system, would shy away from providing that opportunity for that competition. We want those students who aren't doing well in a public school to see if they can do well in a private school, because they're failing in that school. They're failing in the public school, move them over there. If it doesn't work there, again, the option exists for them to go wherever they wish. We are spending about half of what it costs in the public school, but because of some of the things you talked about. There are things in place that are that are infrastructure costs that we understand aren't necessarily as high or as necessary in the private schools. That's why you don't see quite the same level. It is about half to maybe 60% in most school districts. And so you see a reduced amount of funding going there. Ultimately, I think the idea that often comes up, especially from retired teachers and others that I've talked to throughout the years, that we are taking public money and putting it into a private system is just the wrong way to look at it. I mean, I just don't look at it that way. I look at it as, we have a child that needs an education. Where are we going to do that? How are they going to get that education? And if it's not working in the public school, then put them wherever they need to go to get that education. Not to the detriment of the public school, but to the benefit of that student. That's really the way that the voucher system is looked at, sir.
Mike, excuse me. I have two children, one who is multiply handicapped. She functioned quite well in the special education program of the public school. I have another child, or not another child, my children are all adults now, but she went to a public school. She didn't make it. We transferred her from the public school into a Christian school, Christian education school, and she functioned extremely well because it was a disciplined program. We took her, she went to that school through the 8th grade and then went to one of our high schools in Wausau, and she failed miserably because she couldn't function in the modular scheduling program at that time. But to say that the private schools are not teaching well is really a misstatement. I know that, for example, there's a school out here in the country, we have a church school that graduated students that went from the 8th grade that went into the high school, and they were functioning in higher 10% of that particular high school. So to say that private schools are not functioning, I think is really a misstatement, and I really support totally your voucher program, and I think that hopefully it will expand.
Yeah, let's admit one thing. There are students that are going to do very well in public school. My students are in public schools, the governor's students are in public schools, and they do well in those areas. There will be students that will fail in public schools, but the same is true in private schools.
Yes.
They will exceed and succeed in some of those schools, and they will fail in some of those
Well,
schools.
we had two children who succeeded very well in the public schools.
Right.
They did need, one needed some private attention because of dyslexia.
Right.
But
Right.
they succeeded quite well.
Yeah.
So you're right.
The goal is, I'll go to you next, but the goal is to provide that education for those children. Not to, again, not to the detriment of either the private or public school system, but to the benefit of the child.
It's about the children.
Right. Right. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Representative Mandy Wright. This is my district. Thank you
Hi,
very
Mandy.
much for coming. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
And I appreciate Keen bringing you here as well. I'm really happy that everybody showed up to hear more about the budget. I think this is a really healthy discussion. Thank you. So I agree that it is really important. My background is education, so I care deeply about our students and their success. So I agree, we have excellent public and private schools here in our district. And I really don't want to see the system change. I'm concerned about voucher schools because when I look at this Legislative Fiscal Bureau report and I look at the guidelines for public schools, I'm just going to read off really quickly what the guidelines are, what the certification requirements are, and let you make the decision if that's the kind of school system that we want here. So first of all, the pupil achievement standards. Each private school is required to meet at least one of the following standards in order to continue to be eligible to participate in the program in the following year. The first one is at least 70% of the pupils in the program advance one grade level each year. That's one thing that can certify a school, if only 70% of the students move forward. I know that in our public schools it's much better than that. The second one is the school's average attendance rate for pupils in the program is at least 90%. I'd say we do well and above 90% for most of our schools. Number three, at least 80% of the pupils in the program demonstrate significant academic progress. I'd be very interested to know what's the rubric for significant academic progress. Number four, at least 70% of the families of pupils in the program meet parent involvement criteria established by the school, which I understand is basically 2 meetings a year. And the determination of whether a school meets at least one of the standards is made by the state superintendent. So when we talk about all the accountability requirements for our public schools, we have a lot of new accountability requirements. And to be funding a program like this that is so much different, the accountability levels are so much less, I just really question the integrity of this program and whether it's best for our kids.
I would encourage you to explore some of those private schools in Milwaukee. Go down and determine whether or not they're meeting those goals. Because I can tell you, I think the first one was 70% move from grade to grade. That isn't happening in the Milwaukee public school system. The Milwaukee public school system graduation rate is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40%. I mean, which means 6 out of every 10 students that enroll as freshmen will not graduate. That is a failing system. Those are the areas that we need to address, and you see that emulated in other areas like Racine and other parts of the state where we have serious problems.
And that's okay there, but that's not the system we have here.
Which is why Wausau won't be eligible for this program.
Wausau's not proposed.
Wausau is eligible through the special education vouchers.
The special education scholarship program. The new scholarship program, is that what you're referring to?
And, well, first of all, earlier you had insinuated that you'd like to see vouchers statewide, and some people in the audience had asked, why don't we have it here yet? And you said, I'd like to see it here, basically, but we just, we don't want to go too fast.
Yeah, right, I understand.
Okay.
You're right, no, you're right, I understand.
And also the special education voucher, also there was a statewide certification board that was proposed.
Mhm.
So then Wausau would be open for voucher schools.
Well, eventually, it is up to the governor to determine whether or not he wants to introduce the expansion of school choice statewide. I can tell you that when I was in the legislature, I suggested that we needed school vouchers in some of the school districts. But in the La Crosse area, I didn't see the need for it. I didn't think it would be used that much. I think really it comes down, as the governor's proposed, into kind of a local decision. If there are two schools that are failing in your school district, then you guys have the option to determine if you're going to go forward, if you meet the other criteria. Wausau is not one of those, but
It's not actually a local decision right now, though, let's be clear, because the 8 school districts that are listed as being, in the budget, that's being foisted upon them. It's been suggested that it go to referendum, but that hasn't happened yet.
Right, well, again, the local decision is whether or not it's going to happen in that particular community. It also, I mean, I think when we need to get back to the other idea of what a local decision is. The local decision begins in the household. That's your local decision. You as parents make that decision for what's best for your child. That's the first local decision that's made. And from then, you move on to your elected representatives. This is really providing that option, allowing them to determine whether or not it's best for their students and in their family to be able to go and get an education somewhere else. It doesn't have to be in the public school, it doesn't have to be in a charter school, it doesn't have to be in a voucher school. But finding that education that is going to be best for them and in their family. And that's really what we're focusing on. Let me check some others and I'll come back to that.
Just in relation to that,
Or
I
you
want to
can
make sure I'm understanding.
Yes, sir.
Are you suggesting then the governor does support that before that decision is made, to have a private voucher school, that decision should be made at the local level?
No, I'm not suggesting anything that's different than what the governor has proposed in his budget.
So that, you're saying that should not be a local decision? We should have these criteria, and if the governor or whoever it might be decides, then it should not be up to the local, whoever it might be.
No, I'm not saying that either. What I'm saying is what the governor's put in his budget is what he'd like to see happen with the private school voucher system. Yes, ma'am.
First, I'd like to thank you and the Walker administration for beginning to make Wisconsin a more positive experience for business owners. I own a business. In the last year and a half or so, I've had very positive experiences with the state of Wisconsin. I own a foundry, and I've even had positive experiences with the DNR, so wow. I appreciate that. I have two questions. One is, are you looking at redundancy in state programs? As again, I'm most familiar with programs that are oriented to assisting business, but it seems there's redundancy between federal programs, state programs, what the universities provide, what the technical colleges provide, almost a competition among them for your interest. And I was wondering if you're looking at that.
Yep.
And my second question is, are you looking at public-private partnerships for development of infrastructure?
Yes. I'll answer both those questions. First, the public-private partnership in infrastructure. That is something we are looking at. That is something that for Wisconsin is in its infancy, because entering into those agreements with the private sector to try and make sure that we're developing our infrastructure is something that we have to move carefully along, because the way you provide infrastructure in the private sector is very different than you do it in the public sector, and that's something that it's been a challenge to explain to some people along the way. You know, when you're a contractor, or you're a builder, or you're in a foundry or something like that, and you need work done, you can contact the person you know who's going to do the job and do it well, and you're going to call them up. And if that person happens to also be a neighbor or a friend who you know is going to do a good job for you, that's great. It works out well for you. That's not what you can do in the public sector. You have to make sure that there is an opportunity for all contractors to have an opportunity to bid on that, to make sure that under a request for proposal, it's going to be done above board and with great transparency. So all of those things are necessary. It's a delicate relationship as we move forward in that. Your first question was?
Redundancy.
Yeah, redundancy. The joke in government is the Department of Redundancy Department. What we're doing in those areas, and this is, you're right, when you take a look at the federal level and then the state level of regulation, most notably in DNR for years and years, but even in other areas, what you've always seen is that challenge of making sure that the federal level for a lot of people in Wisconsin was just the floor, and it wasn't anywhere near enough as far as what we needed to do to regulate our businesses, to regulate the way we do things. And for years there has been that competition to make sure that we are a little bit more strict in whatever area it is than the federal government, to make sure that our system is better, our regulation is more protective, and all those type of things. Each agency is looking at those. Each agency is determining whether or not we do need to have a different model than the federal government, because in many states that is the standard for what they have, regardless of the agency and regardless of what they have overseen. We have a lot of that in Wisconsin where it goes well beyond. And we have specifically, actually, the Office of Business Development is looking at and has developed the Small Business Regulatory Review Board. Excuse me, if you haven't heard of that, I would encourage you to go out and go online and provide some of the insight that you have, because what they're doing and what the legislature is doing right now is they're seeking out ways that we can figure out where there is that redundancy, where there is unnecessary regulation, and take that to the legislature so that they can act upon that. So those are the type of things that are happening right now. The governor established this review board to make sure that that businesses have the opportunity to report back and let us know when there's just, those of us in government don't necessarily see the day-to-day operation that you do. We need to hear from you. So where you have that, where you know that that's occurring, let us know, and we'll send it to the legislature, and hopefully we can act upon it. Somebody else? Yes, sir.
Why do you think the state is doing so poorly versus our neighbors economically, when we've done all these things that are right, that are supposed to get us ahead?
Yeah, it's a very good question. In Wisconsin, we do basically two things as far as our economy is concerned. We're agricultural-based, we grow things, and we make things. We're manufacturing-based. Manufacturing, especially over the last decade or 15 years, really took it in the teeth as far as the economy is concerned. Our manufacturing base is coming back. It's developing back. But a lot of our infrastructure was built on that manufacturing base. And so as that comes back, in years past, that has been the thing that has always been the last thing that took us into a recession, and always was the last thing that brought us out of a recession, was that base that we have for our economy. So we're kind of the last ones pulling out of it. But when we do, they're family supporting jobs. That's manufacturing that is going on and expanding in almost every sector and every community in our state, but it comes back slowly. We're trying to get to a point where we can diversify that infrastructure, diversify our economy. But that's I think why we are trailing behind some of the others. But in the same sense, I think you're seeing growth here in Wisconsin, where we really took a very difficult few years, about 150,000 jobs lost in the 3 years prior to the governor being elected, that we're turning that around and bringing it back. We were in quite a hole. I mean, the recession was difficult across the country, and we certainly felt it here in Wisconsin. So I think that's why you're seeing some of the turn back.
We had much the same situation as Minnesota and Illinois and Iowa. And going into 2010, we had actually improved from the previous year in our economic ranking out of 50 states. So we were getting better, and then by the time we hit 2012, we've gone from, I think it was 12th or 13th in 2010 to 48. We had improved from 2011, we were 50th in 2011, by 2012 we improved to, I think it was 48.
I don't know what ranking you're referring to, but I can tell you that in the rankings that we've seen, in everything from the economic climate and those states where businesses want to grow and expand, we have jumped substantially. We went from in the 40s when the governor first came into office to in the low 20s, even approaching the high teens as far as some of the magazines that test where there's good economic or business climate. So you've seen significant improvement over the last few years from those standards. I don't know which ones you're referring to, but the one thing that we have seen as far as just monitoring and determining the success of and the desire of businesses here in Wisconsin who say that we're doing well, our state Chamber of Commerce monitors and tests and surveys businesses across the state. In 2010, there were about 10% of businesses that said we were headed in the right direction. In 2012, 93% said we were headed in the right direction. That's a significant turnaround. Yes, sir.
A couple more questions.
An economics question. I don't think it's center or right. Maybe it's center or right.
Well, in your right place.
The governor wants to provide a $340 million income tax. And the reason for that is not politics, but grow the economy, create jobs, investment. I don't understand this economic point of view. If the state government spends $340 million in income tax rebate, why does that create more economic spin if you spent that in local aids, transportation spending?
Sure.
Wouldn't a dollar spent this way have the same economic effect? In fact, is a dollar spent over here?
Sure. Well, fundamentally, if government is spending money versus the private sector, you can have the discussion there. But this isn't a rebate. This is a tax rate cut. So basically what we're just saying is that it will reduce over the next 2 years income taxes by $343 million. But over the next 10 years, it's 1.7 trillion, or billion. So basically what you see is as that goes every year, what we've done is actually reduced the percentage by which you're taxed. More money will be in your pocket every year. You're not going to have to send as much money in because we're reducing the percentage in those tax brackets, the lower and middle income tax brackets specifically. But that's an ongoing reduction in taxes, which means that over the next 10 years where you have $1.7 billion that could be going to Madison, instead it's staying in the communities. It's staying in your pocket. That's how the economy grows and expands. You don't necessarily see, I mean, one of the things that, is that not, do you not understand?
If the dollar goes to Madison and it comes back by the local school, why is that creating less jobs and keep them by less?
Because 80% of the income that comes into the state comes through our sales and income tax. Most notably the income tax and the rest in the sales tax. So if we keep the money into the local economy and you are able to spend that yourself, that will expand our economy. You'll be able to expand jobs and economy in your community. And as you have more economy going on, I mean, the flip side is, why don't we just send it all to Madison? I mean, you know, that's, if you take that to its ultimate end, if we just take everything we earn and send it to Madison, well, then we'll all be fine economically. And that simply isn't the case.
I'm saying, what's the difference?
The significant difference between investment and economic growth in the private sector, as opposed to spending by the public sector, is that the private sector grows and expands an economy. The public sector spends the money that it is able to take for programs that people wish to have. But that doesn't exactly create an economy, it doesn't expand jobs, it doesn't help those along that way.
But the money goes into the economy.
Again, the ultimate end, as you said, is then let's send it all to Madison. I mean, let's have the government spend all of it.
That's part of it.
Yes, sir.
There's a simple solution to that problem, and it is that the questioner is educated in the school of Lord Keynes and didn't read Hazlitt, Hayek, Adams, or Friedman.
Sure I did.
Says that every dollar that the government spends is extracted from the private economy. It comes at the expense of the economy. And every flood of money into the economy raises the cost of doing business and the cost of commodities. It's just a difference in the way people look at the subject.
Correct. Keen, are you giving me the hook? Is that what that is?
We're getting close to the end.
Okay.
Yes, one more question.
This is quick. What calculation did you make regarding health care in not accepting the federal Medicaid dollars as far as how many would be uninsured in your hybrid system versus the expansion of Medicaid?
Right. What we sat down with our state budget shop is we determined how many people we're going to have eligibility for the health care that are now capped out, that they're under the caps and so they don't have access to Medicaid. And so what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to put that many people more, give them the coverage.
Your formula. I just want to know the numbers. What numbers you have in both systems? The uninsured.
Off the top of my head, I don't have that. I mean, that's something that we developed in December, and I don't have it handy, but I know that we have that available in our budget papers. That essentially the number of 224,000 that will no longer, or who will be insured, something even the governor mentioned in his budget address, because what we're doing is we're moving not only the people who are under the caps off of those, but also people into the private healthcare exchange through the Affordable Care Act. So those people will have access to that healthcare as well. But the numbers off the top of my head, I just don't have them. Sorry. Yes, ma'am.
I'm on the county board, and I'm on the county board, and I'm wondering if the state is going to continue to encourage regionalization. I've been involved in ADRC, for one thing, CCCW, and I'm just wondering if the state is going to continue to encourage that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. When I was in the legislature in the early 90s or the mid 90s, the governor put together a task force on state and local partnerships. And one of the first things we did was just look at history and what we have here in the state. Does anybody know why we have 72 counties in the state? It is how far you could ride a horse in a day. That's, I mean, how far you could ride a horse, that's where the next county seat was. And so we recognize that maybe that isn't the way we should do things anymore. Going to regionalization is something that that really started with, Governor Thompson talking about it back in the early and mid-90s. But it's something that is slow to come because there are still parochial interests, there's still a lot of walls that need to be broken down. And unfortunately, because you have had that system for so long, that's kind of the way the funding is designed as well. So if you're going to move toward more regionalization, you have to make some statutory changes along the way. And those are the things that kind of occur. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it.